His gaze dropped for a second. Then he left her at the depot. Micah's brow furrowed. Paul's voice tightened a fraction. The train station worker told her Julian already paid for a ticket home to get rid of her. A pause. She cried the whole train ride back. Silence settled between them for a moment, heavier now than before. Paul leaned back in his chair again, rubbing his thumb along the edge of his glass. So you can imagine, he said quietly, what that did to her. He didn't look at Micah when he finished. Just stared down at the table for a moment, like he was replaying something he'd rather not be seeing again. Micah went quiet for a moment. The story didn't land all at once. It settled in pieces, like his brain was trying to separate what sounded real from what sounded too sharp to be real. That must have been the girl he mentioned on the yacht, Micah said slowly. Paul nodded once. The one he said got hurt, Micah added more quietly now, because she thought it meant something. Paul didn't respond immediately. Micah leaned back in his chair, looking down at the table like he was recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the last few days. So that's why he does that, Micah said, the rules, the don't get attached thing. Paul gave a small humorless shrug. Yeah, he said, after that he started being very upfront, almost aggressively upfront. Micah's jaw tightened slightly. And he just left her there, Micah asked, still trying to process it. On the mainland, Paul confirmed, bought her a ticket and walked away. Micah shook his head slowly, disgust creeping into his expression. She was 16, he said. Yeah, Paul said quietly. Micah exhaled through his nose, looking down at his hands. What kind of guy does that, he muttered. Paul didn't sugarcoat it. An asshole, he said simply. A pause. Then he added more tiredly, like this wasn't the first time he'd had to describe it. He's gotten worse over the years. Micah looked up slightly at that. Paul continued, voice lower now. I swear, he can be petty about it too, like it's some kind of game sometimes. He'll act kind just long enough for someone to think it means something, then shut it down completely when it starts getting real. Micah frowned. He enjoys it, he asked. Paul hesitated. Not enjoys like he's laughing about it, he said. But yeah, he likes control, he likes being the one who defines what things are. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table again. And he does that thing where he'll get close to someone, let them think they matter more than they do, and then pull the rug out before it turns into something complicated. Paul looked at Micah then more directly. That's what I meant earlier, he said. People here aren't exceptions to him, they're experiences. The words hung there for a moment. And for the first time, the warning didn't sound like gossip. It sounded like history. Paul shifted in his seat a little, as he'd said enough already and was now deciding whether to keep going. He glanced briefly at the book on the table. I saw you reading Morris earlier, he said. Micah looked up slightly. Paul cleared his throat. I'm a straight guy and everything, he added quickly. I don't judge what you're into, I'm not homophobic or anything like that. He hesitated, choosing his next words more carefully. Just, maybe you'll understand what I'm trying to say if I put it like this. Micah stayed quiet, waiting. Paul nodded toward the book again. Julian's kind of like one of the characters in Morris, he said, Clive Durham. Micah frowned slightly, processing that. Paul continued anyway. He'll have a good time, he said, but at the end of the day he's going to marry a woman. He's going to do what his family expects, please his parents, inherit the money, all of that. A pause. And the most you're going to be to him, Paul added more bluntly now, is either a good time or a mistake he has to correct later when he gets serious about his real life. Micah's expression tightened slightly at that phrasing, but Paul didn't soften it. When you actually like him, Paul said, you're already in the part of the story where he's not thinking about staying. He leaned back a little, exhaling through his nose. I'm not saying this to be harsh, he added. I'm saying it because I've seen it before, more than once. The noise of the restaurant carried on around them, clinking plates, distant laughter, but their table felt quieter now. He looked at Micah again, more seriously this time. You just got here, Paul said, and I think you're already in deeper than you realize. Paul looked uncomfortable now in a different way, less like he was choosing words carefully, more like he was realizing he'd said too much and couldn't really take it back. He picked up his water glass and took a long sip, buying himself a second before continuing. Last summer, he said, setting the glass down, he brought a girl down here. Micah's attention stayed on him, quiet but alert. I assume he's still with her, Paul added. Or at least he was, you know, high school relationships looks good all that. He shrugged slightly. He actually started to mellow last summer, not as much of an asshole as he used to be. A faint uncertain pause followed. Like noticeably better, Paul admitted. He treated her better too, a lot better. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. Maybe he's changed, he said, though the tone suggested he didn't fully believe it himself. I doubt it, but maybe he's more of a good guy than he used to be. Then his expression hardened slightly again, like he was pulling himself back to his main point. But 2 years ago, Paul said, he was an asshole. Micah didn't respond. Paul looked at him more directly now. So, just don't let any feelings get involved, he said firmly. Julian doesn't like complications, he likes to get in, get out, and enjoy himself in all ways, his life, his business, whatever the hell he's doing with you. That last part landed a little heavier, but Paul didn't soften it. When things get complicated, he added, he removes himself, that's what he does, clean break, no discussion, no easing into it. He tapped his fingers once against the table. And people around here learn not to expect anything different. Paul had just taken a bite of corn on the cob when Micah asked it. The question landed mid-chew. He choked slightly, coughing into his napkin, setting the food down quickly while he recovered. Even if, Micah started again more carefully now, even if Julian caught feelings for me, what would happen? Paul wiped his mouth, still a little caught off guard. That, he said finally, would be worse, much worse. Micah blinked. Paul leaned back in his chair, shaking his head once like he couldn't believe the direction the conversation had gone. Worse than you catching feelings for him, Paul clarified, because then it stops being simple for him. Micah stayed quiet listening. Paul continued, more deliberate now, like he was laying something out he'd already thought through before. Julian likes control, he said. Control over situations, over people, over how things end. He's not the kind of guy who sits around and lets things develop into emotional problems he didn't sign up for. He tapped his fingers lightly against the table. And catching feelings for a guy, Paul added, that doesn't fit into how he's built his life. Micah's expression tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Paul exhaled through his nose. So if that happened, he said, it wouldn't turn into some romantic exception, it wouldn't turn into a he finally realizes you're different situation. He shook his head again. It would just mean he shuts it down faster. Micah frowned slightly. Paul's voice stayed steady, but the content got sharper. Julian doesn't do second chances with people, he said. He doesn't do we'll figure it out later. He doesn't circle back, ever. A beat. It doesn't matter if he likes you a lot, Paul continued, or hates you or is confused, the outcome is the same. Micah's grip on his fork tightened without him noticing. Paul went on, more blunt now. He'd remove the variable. Micah looked up slightly. Paul didn't soften it. If he thought feelings were getting in the way of how he wants his life to run, he'd cut it out, cleanly, completely. He gestured vaguely, like he was trying to illustrate something simple. No long goodbye, no emotional conversation, just done. Micah swallowed. Paul leaned forward slightly now, voice lowering. Julian doesn't organize his life around feelings or sentiment, he said. If anything, he treats that stuff like a liability. A pause. And I'm not saying that to be dramatic, Paul added. I'm saying it because that's how he's always been here. He took a slower breath. Hell, he said, quieter now, he'd sell his own mother's wedding ring if it got him something he actually wanted. Micah's expression shifted slightly at that. Paul continued, eyes steady. He doesn't follow his heart, he said, he follows outcomes. Another beat. And if he decided something or someone was a complication instead of an advantage. Paul shrugged faintly. He'd cut it out of his life. Silence settled over the table for a moment, heavier than before. And that's why, Paul finished, it doesn't really matter if he falls for you or not. He looked directly at Micah now. Either way, it ends the same. Micah hesitated for a moment after Paul finished speaking. Then he asked it anyway. Has Julian ever been in love? Paul paused. Not a small pause either, long enough that it was clear he didn't have a ready answer. Either during the summer, Micah added, or back where he lives. Paul shifted in his seat, suddenly looking less confident than he had during the rest of the conversation. He picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and set it down like he was stalling for time. I heard a rumor once, he said finally, not from Julian, from a girl who knows people around here. Micah watched him closely. Paul leaned back slightly. When Julian was about 14, he continued, he met somebody. A pause. And from what I heard, it wasn't like what you're describing now. Micah's brow tightened slightly. Paul frowned as he tried to piece together something he didn't fully trust even as he said it. I guess he wasn't the one in control of it that time, Paul said. He wasn't the one taking someone out on the boat, he was the one being taken along, emotionally speaking. Micah stayed quiet. Paul continued more carefully now. And apparently it didn't go well. He shrugged, but it was less dismissive than before. I don't know if it was a guy or a girl, he admitted. I don't know, and honestly I don't care, that's all I ever heard. A beat. I don't know if he fell in love or not, Paul added. I just know something happened that he didn't like how it made him feel. Micah leaned forward slightly. Paul exhaled. And after that, he said, he got a lot more focused on control. He gestured faintly with his fork. He doesn't like variables he can't manage, he doesn't like emotional unpredictability, especially anything that doesn't look like it could turn into, he searched for the right phrase, then settled on it, a nuclear family situation. He gave a small dry shrug. If you know what I mean. Then he went back to eating his shrimp like the conversation had reached its natural endpoint, even though the weight of what he'd said lingered heavily in the space between them. Paul held it together for about 2 seconds after that. Then he lost it. A short laugh broke out first, like he tried to suppress it and failed. Then it grew, sharper and more uncontrolled, his shoulders shaking as he leaned forward over the table. I'm sorry, he said, still laughing, He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. I would pay to be in the room, Paul said, wiping at his eyes, if Julian ever brought you home to meet his parents. That made him laugh harder again. I've met Mrs. Ayers, he added between breaths, and God forbid that ever happens. Micah sat still watching him. Paul doubled over slightly, one hand on the table now, still trying and failing to calm himself down. There is no chance, he said finally, still chuckling, that Julian is ever going to see you as anything beyond a summer person he takes along on his yacht. He finally managed to catch his breath, but the smile didn't leave his face. No offense, he added quickly, still amused. I'm sure you've got great attributes, but that situation is just fucked. I don't even know what else to say. He leaned back, shaking his head in disbelief, like the whole idea itself was almost absurd. Then, still smiling, he looked at Micah a little more directly. You really don't know much about Julian, do you? Paul said. But this time the laughter had faded underneath it. And what replaced it wasn't mockery anymore, it was something closer to certainty. Paul's laughter tapered off gradually, like it had burned itself out rather than been consciously stopped. He leaned back in his chair, still wearing a faint grin, but it didn't last. Then something shifted again. His expression went more neutral, less amused, more intent. Have you seen that gold chain Julian wears? Paul asked. Micah nodded slowly. Paul tilted his head slightly. Have you ever seen what's on the end of it? Micah frowned. No, he said, I haven't really noticed it that closely. Paul let out a short breath through his nose. God, he muttered, like that answered something for him. He didn't tell you. Micah's brow tightened. Tell me what? Paul tapped his fingers once against the table, like he was deciding how to phrase it without getting into something he didn't want to fully unpack. He never does, Paul said, not about that. Micah leaned forward slightly now. What are you talking about? Paul hesitated, then shook his head faintly. It's not something he's ashamed of, he said, that's not it. A pause. It just makes people uncomfortable when it comes up. Micah's confusion deepened. What makes people uncomfortable? Paul looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then he sniffed lightly, almost like he was about to say something he didn't feel like fully explaining out loud. "You really don't know what I'm talking about, do you?" he said. Micah shook his head once. "No." Paul exhaled, then leaned back again, eyes drifting briefly away like he was checking how much he should say. "Look," he said finally, more carefully now, "Julian doesn't really talk about personal history, especially not things tied to his family or where he comes from." He paused. "And that chain," Paul added, "isn't just jewelry." Micah's expression stayed fixed on him. Paul didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, he reached for his drink again, took a sip, and set it down. Like he was choosing to stop right at the edge of something, leaving the rest implied rather than spoken. Paul stopped himself mid-thought. It was like he realized, a second too late, that he'd already crossed a line he didn't want to fully step over. He cleared his throat, suddenly more restrained. "Listen," he said, quieter now, "I don't want to get too personal." He shifted in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not my place to talk about my friend's private business." Micah stayed still, watching him closely. Paul exhaled. "I'm just saying," he continued carefully, "there's no chance anything's going to happen between you and Julian, not in private, not in public, not in any version of this." He paused, then added more bluntly, like he couldn't fully soften it. "It won't happen." Micah's jaw tightened slightly. Paul leaned forward a bit, lowering his voice as if that made it less sharp. "Julian is more likely to completely change his entire life before he ends up in a serious gay relationship with you," he said. He hesitated again, then seemed to realize how extreme that sounded, but didn't fully retract it. "That's just not how his world works," he added. "A bit. And if his family ever found out, if anything like that became public, it would be catastrophic for him socially, for them." Paul shook his head slightly. "You don't understand the environment he comes from." Micah didn't respond. Paul's expression tightened again, and he looked briefly away. "So don't build expectations," he said, "that's all I'm saying." Another pause. He rubbed his hand over his mouth once, then added more quietly, "I'm honestly a little surprised anything even happened at all between you two." That last line lingered in the air longer than the rest. Not judgment exactly. More like disbelief, mixed with concern he wasn't sure he should be expressing out loud. Paul scratched his forehead, looking like he was trying to decide how much of this he should even be saying out loud. Micah didn't let the silence sit long. "Is Julian's family homophobic or something?" he asked. Paul let out a short, uncomfortable laugh, not because it was funny but because the question was harder than he wanted it to be. "It's hard to put into words," he said. He leaned back in his chair slightly, eyes drifting toward the marina for a second like he was checking whether this conversation should even be happening in public. "I mean, Julian's very tight-lipped about his feelings, his beliefs, his way of life," Paul continued carefully, "and it's not really my place to speak for him or for them." Micah waited. Paul exhaled through his nose. "I will say this," he added more cautiously now, "some of the views in his family circle socially, politically, they lean more traditional, very old money, very WASP." He hesitated, choosing his wording. "Not exactly welcoming," he said finally, "especially not toward anything that would be considered outside their expectations." A pause. Then he added more bluntly, "Especially not if you're involved with their son in that way." Micah's expression tightened slightly at the phrasing, but Paul kept going, like he wanted to be honest without being inflammatory. "I'm not saying they're cartoon villains," Paul said. "They're polite, they're composed, they're socially polished. The Ayers family is very prestigious." He shook his head slightly. "But they're not going to open their arms to you," he added. "Not in any warm, accepting way, not if they even suspected what you're talking about." Paul leaned forward a little, lowering his voice. "And Julian knows that," he said. "That's part of why he keeps things compartmentalized." He tapped his finger once against the table. "It's not just about him being an asshole," Paul added more quietly. "It's also about survival in the world he's expected to live in." The noise of the restaurant filled the gap after that, clinking plates, distant voices, but their table felt tighter now, like the space had shrunk around what had just been said. Paul finally looked at Micah again, expression softer but still serious. "That's what I mean," he said. "There are a lot of lines around Julian that people don't really cross, not without consequences." Paul hesitated, then reached across the table and lightly took Micah's hand, more of a grounding gesture than anything intimate. "Listen," he said, softer now, "I'm sure you're an amazing guy. Anyone here would be lucky to know you, honestly." Micah didn't pull away immediately, just stared at him, processing. "I just don't want to see another person crying their eyes out on a train leaving this island," Paul continued. "It's happened before, and it's not fun for anyone who's seen it." He swallowed slightly. "There have been girls over the years," he added. "I'm sure some of them fell hard for him, we just didn't always see the fallout." Paul shook his head once. "Julian is a charming guy," he said. "A player, that part isn't news." Then his tone shifted again, firmer, more absolute. "But if you're thinking he's going to wake up one day and decide you're his soulmate or something," he let out a short, humorless breath. "No, I'd bet anything that's not happening." He held Micah's gaze. "And not because he's secretly confused, closeted, or anything like that," Paul added quickly, as if correcting a potential misunderstanding before it formed. "It's deeper than that, it's how he sees everything." Micah's fingers tightened slightly under Paul's hand. Paul continued more carefully now. "The way he was raised, the environment he's in, it shapes people. Sometimes it locks things in place. Not everything changes just because you want it to." A pause. "And Julian," Paul exhaled, "Julian believes certain things about life, about control, about what's acceptable, about what isn't." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "He doesn't think that gay relationships are okay," Paul said, "and acting on it is worse." The words landed heavily, even in the middle of the busy restaurant. Paul finally let go of Micah's hand and leaned back slightly, like he regretted how far he'd gone. "That's all I'm going to say," he added quickly. "And honestly, we should stop here. Julian would be furious if he knew I was talking about him like this." He glanced down at the table, rubbing his thumb against his knuckle. "I just don't want you building something in your head that's going to hurt you later." Paul exhaled slowly, like he was trying to decide whether he should keep going or shut the whole topic down completely. "The last thing I'll say," he said, quieter now, "is this." Micah stayed still, watching him. "He's not angry at you," Paul continued, "at least not in the way you think he is." Micah's eyes narrowed slightly, waiting. Paul hesitated, then pushed through it anyway. "He's angry at himself." A pause. "Or not even angry," he corrected himself. "It's more like he carries a lot of self-loathing, most of the time, honestly." Micah didn't interrupt. Paul leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting briefly toward the marina outside, like he regretted opening this door at all. "And it's not just about same-sex attraction," Paul added carefully. "It's about any kind of sexual attraction, period, any situation where he loses control of how things are defined." Micah's expression tightened slightly at that. Paul continued anyway, voice more measured now. "He's not the kind of person who experiences things and just lets them exist," he said. "He processes them, labels and judges them, and if it doesn't fit whatever internal system he has, he turns it inward." A pause. "And that's where the self-loathing comes in." Micah looked down at the table briefly, thinking. Paul rubbed his thumb against his knuckle, clearly uncomfortable, but committed to finishing his thought. "So, when things get physical or emotional or anything that crosses into attachment territory," he said, "it doesn't just become a moment for him, it becomes something he has to deal with internally afterward." He shook his head slightly. "And he doesn't deal with it well." Micah stayed quiet. Paul continued more carefully now, like he was trying to separate explanation from justification. "It's probably part of why he's avoiding you," he said. "Not because you did anything wrong, not because you're a guy, not even because of you specifically. A beat. It's because you represent something he doesn't know how to categorize without it turning into a problem in his head." Micah's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. Paul exhaled through his nose. "And don't misunderstand me," he added quickly. This isn't just about sexual attraction to men or women, it's broader than that. He doesn't really attach cleanly to anyone. He gestured vaguely with his hand, searching for words. He'll sleep date or whatever, Paul said, but afterwards when it starts to feel real or complicated, he tends to spiral internally. A pause. And then he pulls away. Micah's expression stayed unreadable, but his attention was fixed. Paul looked down at his plate, then back up. He's not married to girls, guys, or anyone in between, he said. He doesn't really commit in a way that stabilizes emotionally. He hesitated again. And when he feels like he's losing control of that, of himself, of the situation, he tends to shut it down. Micah finally spoke quietly. So he just hates himself for it. Paul nodded once. Yeah, he said, most of the time, yes. A long pause settled between them. Paul shifted in his seat, visibly wanting to move on from the topic now. Look, he said more firmly, let's not stay on this. He glanced down the table, then back. It makes me uncomfortable thinking about what happens next when you leave. Micah frowned slightly. Paul continued, lowering his voice. I can already hear the conversation, he said, the awkward goodbye, the emotional shutdown, the distance afterward. A beat. I was there when it happened with Beatrice. Micah's eyes flickered at the name again. Paul nodded once, more serious now. She was crying on the train, he said. Same situation, different summer, different person. He leaned back slightly. That's why I'm telling you all this, he added, not because I think you're the same as her, but because I've seen the pattern enough times to recognize where it goes. He picked up his fork again but didn't eat. And I don't want you to be the next one standing on that platform wondering what you did wrong when you didn't do anything wrong at all. Paul rubbed the side of his thumb against the rim of his glass, like he was trying to steady his thoughts before continuing. And I will say, he went on, quieter now, time doesn't really change this part of him. Micah watched him carefully. Whenever Julian is attracted to somebody, Paul said, sleeps with them or even just gets pulled into that kind of situation, he doesn't just move on from it. He hesitated. He feels shame. Micah's expression tightened slightly. Paul nodded once like he knew how that sounded. And I think that's because of how he was raised, he added. The environment, the expectations, all of it, it's not something he talks about openly, but it's there. A pause. He probably enjoys it in the moment, Paul admitted. That's the thing people don't get, it's not like he doesn't want it or doesn't experience it. He exhaled. But afterwards, before even, there's this internal backlash. Like he's already preparing himself to reject it emotionally. Micah stayed quiet, absorbing it. Paul leaned back slightly. I don't want you to think he hates Micah, he said more firmly now, he doesn't. A beat. He hates what the feeling represents to him. He gestured lightly, searching for the right framing. For him, premarital sex, intimacy, attraction, anything that feels emotionally exposing, it comes with shame attached. Not because of you specifically, but because of what he's been taught it means. Paul paused again, then softened his tone slightly. So when he pulls away, acts cold, or avoids you, he said, it's not rejection in the way you think it is. Another beat. It's more like he's trying to outrun his own reaction to it. Micah listened without interrupting, the weight of what Paul was saying settling in uneven layers rather than all at once. He didn't fully understand it, not in a clean, organized way, but he understood enough to feel something uncomfortable about it. Not pity exactly, not satisfaction either. More like awareness that his presence in Julian's life was doing something he hadn't intended. Paul made it sound like Julian was constantly being pulled in two directions at once, wanting something in the moment, then turning on himself afterward for wanting it at all. Micah's gaze dropped briefly to the table. He wasn't naive enough to think this was about romance in the way stories usually framed it. Paul wasn't describing love, destiny, or any of that. It sounded more like friction, instinct against identity, action against belief, attraction followed by rejection of the fact that the attraction happened at all. Micah exhaled slowly through his nose. So when Paul talked about Julian pulling away, acting cold or shutting things down, it didn't feel like rejection aimed at him anymore. It felt like he was watching someone try to separate themselves from their own reactions, like Julian wasn't just avoiding Micah, but also avoiding what he felt in Micah's presence. That realization didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it messier. Because it meant there wasn't a simple explanation like he doesn't care or he's just using you. It meant there was something there, something real enough to create discomfort, but also something Julian seemed determined not to let exist in any stable form. Micah sat back slightly, his expression tightening in thought. Paul's words still echoed, but now they landed differently in Micah's mind. Not as a verdict on what Julian felt, but as a description of a system that never allowed those feelings to settle anywhere long enough to become something clear. After they finished dinner, the conversation didn't fully recover its earlier lightness, but it did taper off, like both of them had agreed silently to stop digging deeper into things that were already uncomfortable. Paul pushed his chair back first. "I'll walk you back," he said. Micah nodded and followed him out. The air outside the restaurant felt cooler than inside, the sound of the marina replacing the clatter of dishes and voices. They walked side by side for a moment without speaking. When they reached the path leading back toward the cabana house, Paul slowed. "It was nice meeting you, man," he said, offering a small smile. "Really?" Micah gave a faint nod. Paul exhaled, then added more carefully. "I just hope you fare better about all of this than some of the women who have been in your position before now." He held up a hand slightly, like he already knew how that sounded. "And I'm not trying to compare you to them," he clarified quickly. "I just mean there's a pattern here, and I don't want you getting caught in the same emotional headspace they did." A pause. "You're a good guy," Paul said. "Too good, honestly, to have a rough fall just because it started as a nice summer." Micah didn't respond right away. Paul shifted his weight, glancing back toward the house. "I might see you again before you leave," he added, "or maybe I won't, depends how things go." He gave a small shrug. "I'm not telling you to leave early," he said, "or to stay. That's up to you. If you think you can handle how things feel, then stay as long as you want." A beat. Then more quietly. "Just don't expect it to turn into something stable," Paul said. "That's the only real warning I've got left." He gave Micah one last nod, less like a lecture now and more like someone who had said everything they felt responsible to say. Then he turned slightly, as if ready to head off on his own, leaving Micah with the long walk back and even longer thoughts ahead. Micah walked back into the house after dinner more slowly than he needed to. The place was quieter now, lights low, distant sound of the ocean coming in through open doors, but his thoughts weren't. Paul's words kept looping in different versions, like they were trying to settle into something coherent. Beatrice crying on a train. Other women Micah never even met. And Julian at the center of all of it, pulling people close, then stepping back like closeness itself had consequences he couldn't afford. Micah sat down for a moment without really deciding to, staring at nothing in particular. What Paul had described didn't feel like simple cruelty anymore, not in the cartoon sense of someone enjoying hurting people. It felt more conflicted than that. Like Julian wasn't moving through situations cleanly, but leaving behind reactions he didn't know how to resolve. Micah thought back to what Paul had said about shame. Not just about attraction to men or women, but about attraction itself. About intimacy. About anything that blurred into attachment or expectation. Why would someone think that way? Micah tried to make sense of it in pieces. If Julian had been raised to see certain things as unacceptable, or as something that came with consequences beyond just the moment itself, then it would explain why he seemed to separate experience from emotion so aggressively. Why he could be present, even intense, and then suddenly withdraw as if resetting everything. Why things between them could feel real in one moment and completely erase the next. Micah leaned back slightly, rubbing a hand over his face. It wasn't that Julian didn't feel anything. It was that whatever he felt didn't stay in one place long enough to become stable. And if Paul was right, then the coldness wasn't absence. It was avoidance of what came after. Micah exhaled slowly. That didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it more complicated. Because it meant there was something there, something real enough to trigger discomfort, conflict, maybe even shame. But nothing in Julian's world allowed that feeling to become something he could hold onto without it turning into something he needed to shut down. Micah sat there for a moment longer, listening to the house settle around him. And for the first time, the question didn't feel like, does Julian care? It felt more like, what happens when someone isn't allowed to keep what they feel? Micah stayed where he was for a while longer, the house quiet around him in a way that made his thoughts feel louder than they should have been. He wasn't even sure what he felt about Julian in any clean, definable way. That was part of the problem. It shifted too much depending on the moment: anger, confusion, attraction, distance, curiosity, none of it staying still long enough to turn into something simple. And now Paul's voice kept replaying in his head, filling in gaps Micah hadn't even known were there before. Julian doesn't make decisions based on feelings. That line stuck more than anything else. Because if that was true, then the usual rules Micah was used to didn't apply here. It didn't matter if something between them felt mutual in a moment, intense, or real in the way moments sometimes do. Feelings weren't the system Julian was operating on. And Paul had been frustratingly vague about what it was. Not love, not sentiment, not anything that resembled emotional attachment in a straightforward way. Something else, something colder, more controlled, more selective. Micah leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. It made him feel like he was trying to interact with someone who wasn't responding in the same language. Even if Julian did feel something, interest, attraction, curiosity, it didn't mean it would translate into action that lasted, or into anything that could be trusted to continue past the moment it happened in. That was what unsettled Micah the most. Not that Julian didn't feel, but that feelings, even if they existed, didn't seem to be what governed his choices. Micah let out a quiet breath through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face. So where did that leave him? Micah still didn't know what Julian felt. But he was starting to understand something more uncomfortable. It might not matter what either of them felt in the first place. Micah sat back on the couch, staring at nothing in particular as the thoughts kept circling, refusing to settle into anything useful. For a moment he tried to dismiss it all. If Julian wasn't being physical with him anymore, if the distance was already forming, then what was the point of analyzing any of this? Why was he even trying to map meaning onto something that might already be ending? Maybe it was already over. Maybe the last few days, the closeness, the tension, the confusion, had just been a short-lived thing that Julian had already moved past without announcing it. That idea landed with a dull heaviness in Micah's chest. He didn't even know what he felt clearly enough to justify chasing it. And honestly, part of him didn't want a summer romance or anything complicated at all. He'd told himself that before coming here, just something simple, temporary, something that didn't require unpacking or understanding too deeply. Just fun. That had been the plan. But plans didn't account for how quickly things could start to feel loaded with meaning when you were stuck in the same space with someone like Julian, someone unpredictable, someone intense, someone who could be close one moment and distant the next without explanation. Micah thought of Morris again. Of how relationships in that book weren't simple, even when they looked like they should be. Sometimes life didn't just follow expectations, it bent sideways in ways you didn't recognize until you were already inside it. And that was what frightened him most, sitting there in the quiet house. Not that something was happening, but that something could have been happening and might already be shifting into something else without him having any control over it. Micah exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what Julian was to him anymore. But he was starting to realize something worse than uncertainty. If this was a curveball, he might not see it coming until it already hit. Micah heard the front door open. The sound immediately pulled him out of the novel. A moment later came the familiar rhythm of footsteps crossing the foyer. Julian. Micah looked down at the page again instead of toward the door. He was about halfway through Morris now, and unfortunately the timing couldn't have been worse. Clive and Morris had finally reached the point where neither of them could continue pretending things would work. The friendship, the affection, the possibility of something more. All of it had collided with reality. Micah stared at the paragraph for several seconds before reading it again. Two people who genuinely cared about each other. Two people who had once imagined a future together. And yet they still chose separate paths because the world expected certain things from them. It was one of the saddest sections of the book. Not because either man stopped caring, but because caring wasn't enough. Two men who had shared friendship, affection, and dreams. Yet somehow that wasn't enough. Convention won. Expectation won. The future other people wanted for them won. Micah swallowed. The timing of the chapter felt almost cruel. After everything Paul had told him at the restaurant, Clive suddenly reminded him of someone. Someone wealthy. A careful man. Someone who always seemed to choose what made sense over what he felt. Julian, who never allowed himself to be vulnerable for very long. Micah hated the comparison. Mostly because it made too much sense. Another set of footsteps approached the living room. Micah knew without looking who it was. Julian stopped near the doorway. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The silence stretched. Micah kept reading. Or at least pretending to. Finally Julian glanced at the cover. Still reading that fairy book. Micah nodded. It's good. Julian's eyes lingered on the pages. What part are you at? The question surprised Micah. Julian had barely spoken to him in days. Now he was asking about a novel. Micah placed his finger between the pages. Clive and Morris deciding they can't continue being lovers. Something unreadable crossed Julian's face. Gone almost immediately. That was all he said. Just one word. Yet it sounded strangely heavier than it should have. Micah looked up. Julian's expression had already returned to its usual neutral state. What? Micah asked. Nothing. Julian shoved his hands into his pockets. Micah studied him. You don't look like nothing. A small laugh escaped Julian. Not an amused laugh. More like a tired one. That's because books tend to make people think too much. Micah lowered the novel slightly. Maybe that's the point. Julian didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the ocean visible through the windows. For a second he looked oddly distant. Then the moment disappeared. I'm making dinner in an hour, Julian said, if you're hungry. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. But it was the longest sentence Julian had directed toward him since the party. Micah watched him turn away. Julian took 2 steps toward the hallway. Then stopped. Without looking back he said quietly. Don't assume every real-life story ends the way a book does. And then he disappeared upstairs. Leaving Micah alone in the living room with Morris still open in his lap and an entirely new thing to think about. Micah looked up from his book when he sensed movement. Julian was standing in the open space between the living room, dining room, and hallway. Just standing there. Not speaking. Not moving. Not even looking in Micah's direction. The sight was strange enough that Micah lowered Morris slightly. For a few seconds neither of them said anything. Julian's posture seemed unusually rigid, his shoulders squared as if he were thinking about something intensely or trying to make a decision. Micah noticed a scent lingering in the air. It wasn't cologne. At least not the expensive, sharp kind Julian usually wore. This smelled different. Dried wood. Herbal oils. Something earthy and clean. The smell drifted through the room for only a moment before fading. Micah found himself wondering where Julian had been all afternoon. The marina. Town. Some shop on the island. He remembered Paul saying Julian had a habit of disappearing whenever something became emotionally complicated. The thought immediately irritated him. He didn't want to sit around analyzing Julian anymore. He didn't want to become one of those people who spent hours wondering what a glance meant or where someone had gone or why they were acting differently. Yet here he was, watching Julian stand in the middle of the house like a ghost. Trying to understand him. Julian remained motionless for another few seconds. Then he turned. Without a word. Without acknowledging Micah. Without even glancing toward the couch. He walked toward the staircase. The wooden steps creaked beneath his feet. Micah followed him with his eyes. Part of him expected Julian to stop. To say something. Anything. A joke. An insult. A question about the book. Instead, Julian continued upward. When he reached the second-floor landing, he disappeared down the hallway. A moment later. Slam! His bedroom door shut hard enough that the sound echoed through the house. The silence afterward felt enormous. Micah stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then down at his book. Then back toward the stairs. "What is your problem?" he muttered to the empty room. The house offered no answer. Outside, waves rolled against the shoreline. A gull cried somewhere in the distance. Micah looked down at the page he had been reading. Cliven Morris. People choosing distance instead of honesty. People deciding it was easier to walk away than explain themselves. Micah frowned. The comparison was becoming harder and harder to ignore. He tried reading again. Managed 2 paragraphs. Then realized he hadn't absorbed a single word. His eyes kept drifting toward the staircase, wondering what Julian was doing behind that closed door and why, despite everything Paul had said, Julian looked less like a man who was angry at someone else and more like a man who was fighting with himself. Micah stared at the telephone for a long moment before picking up the receiver. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Julian had barely spoken to him for 2 days. Every attempt at understanding what was happening seemed to create more questions instead of answers. Paul's warnings. Julian's avoidance. The slammed doors. The silences. Micah was tired of thinking about it. Tired of wondering. Tired of feeling like he was waiting for someone else's decision. He dialed the number of the restaurant he and Paul had visited earlier that day. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Micah introduced himself and awkwardly asked if they knew any local women who might be interested in spending time with a visitor staying at the big beach house. The person on the other end laughed. Micah laughed nervously too. By the time he hung up, he wasn't entirely sure whether the call had been serious or it was made out of frustration. He set the receiver back in its cradle. The room fell silent again. Immediately, the plan felt less satisfying than it had 30 seconds earlier. Because the truth was that this wasn't really about finding a girl. It was about proving something. To himself. To Julian. Maybe both. Micah leaned against the wall and rubbed his forehead. If Julian wanted distance, then fine. If Julian wanted to pretend nothing had happened between them, fine. Micah could have fun too. He didn't belong to Julian. Julian certainly wasn't acting as if he belonged to Micah. Yet even as he thought it, Micah found himself glancing toward the staircase. Toward the second floor. Toward the closed bedroom door. The same door that had slammed shut earlier. The same door Julian had disappeared behind. Micah frowned. That annoyed him most of all. That somehow Julian still occupied space in his thoughts even while avoiding him. Outside, the last light of sunset faded beyond the windows. The beach house grew darker. For a moment, Micah considered going upstairs and demanding an explanation. Demanding to know why Julian had gone from impossible to escape to impossible to find. Instead, he let out a long breath. Whatever happened next would happen. Tonight he was done chasing answers. Done analyzing every look, every silence, every slammed door. At least that was what he told himself as he headed toward his bedroom. Unfortunately, his thoughts seemed far less convinced than he was. Micah wasn't entirely sure what had motivated the phone call. That was the problem. The more he thought about it, the less certain he became. Part of him wondered if he wanted to make Julian jealous. Another part wondered if he simply wanted to prove something to Julian, to himself, to anyone who might be watching. That he wasn't sitting around waiting for someone else's attention. That he had options. That he wasn't some abandoned passenger on a yacht hoping for scraps of affection. Whatever the reason had been, the decision had already been made. About 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Micah opened the door and found a young woman standing there. She was blonde, attractive, and smiling politely. Immediately, however, another problem became apparent. She only spoke Spanish. Micah's heart sank slightly. Ay. The woman smiled. Hola. Hola, Micah replied. For a moment, they simply stood there looking at one another. Then both laughed. The awkwardness broke some of the tension. Micah remembered a handful of Spanish words from high school. Not many. Certainly not enough for a deep conversation. The woman knew even less English. Still, people had found ways to communicate long before dictionaries existed. Between gestures, smiles, simple words, and patience, they gradually established the basics. Names. Where they were from. Whether they were comfortable. Whether they wanted to spend time together. The important things. The conversation was slow and clumsy, but surprisingly genuine. Because neither of them could hide behind complicated language. Everything had to be simple. Direct. Honest. After a while, they sat together in the living room. Micah found himself relaxing. The woman laughed at his terrible Spanish. Micah laughed at himself too. It wasn't the evening he'd imagined when he'd made that phone call. There was no grand statement being made. No dramatic revenge. No overwhelming sense of victory. Just two people trying to communicate despite a language barrier. And oddly enough, that felt more real than whatever performance Micah had thought he was staging. At one point his eyes drifted toward the staircase. Toward the second floor. Toward Julian's bedroom. The door remained closed. No footsteps. No movement. No sign that Julian even knew there was a guest downstairs. Micah looked away. The woman was smiling at him, waiting patiently for him to finish struggling through another sentence. He smiled back. For the first time all day, he stopped thinking about Julian for a few minutes. Not because Julian no longer mattered, but because there was finally something else in front of him demanding his attention besides confusion. Louisa climbed onto Micah's lap a few minutes after arriving at the summer house. She straddled his hips, knees planted on either side of his body. Micah and Louisa have sex on the couch. Scene retracted, read extended version on Wattpad. Louisa leaned down and kissed Micah messily. Louisa said she had a shift at the restaurant at 9 in the morning. Micah gave Louisa some cab money so she could get back to her home safely. She kissed Micah sweetly on the cheek and asked if Micah wanted to, he could call her again sometime. She left the house, leaving the door slightly open. Micah climbed the stairs with a satisfied smirk after Louisa left. He stripped down to his boxers, crawled into bed and passed out within minutes of his head hitting his pillow. He didn't spare a single thought for Julian. Around 2 in the morning the cabin door creaked open. Footsteps crossed the floor. Micah stayed asleep until the blanket was yanked off completely and hit the ground. Strong hands flipped him onto his stomach before he could react. His boxers were shoved down to his thighs, exposing his bare ass to the moonlight streaming through the window. A heavy body climbed on top of him. Micah heard the tear of a rapper. Micah's eyes flew open. He kicked and thrashed, convinced a stranger was rapping him. A large hand clamped over his mouth, muffling his shout. The familiar scent of Julian's cologne hit him and Micah went limp, his body relaxing under the weight of his housemate. Julian didn't speak. Micah lay pinned on his stomach, face pressed into the mattress. Scene retracted, read extended version on Wattpad. Julian shifted his grip, one hand still over Micah's mouth while the other pressed between his shoulder blades, keeping him flat. Julian climbed off the bed without a word and walked out. The door slammed behind him, leaving Micah alone in the dark with his butt still exposed and the smell of intimacy thick in the air. Micah didn't move for a long time. The beach house stayed silent except for the sound of his own breathing. Micah lay face down on the mattress, his bare ass still exposed to the cool night air, the sheets twisted beneath him. Julian had slammed the door so hard the frame rattled. Micah didn't move right away. His hole throbbed from the brutal pounding, stretched and sore, the memory of Julian's thick cock slamming into him still fresh. He ignored it, his mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why the hell had Julian done that? Micah pressed his face deeper into the pillow, breathing hard through his nose. 2 days of silence. 2 days of Julian acting like he didn't exist, barely grunting a hello when they passed each other in the kitchen or on the porch. And then this, bursting in at 2 in the morning, flipping him over as if he owned him without a single word. Julian was trying to punish him for something, but what? They hadn't even talked. Micah hadn't done anything. He replayed the last couple of days in his head, searching for a clue, Louisa showing up, the way she climbed on top of him right away with that eager sound. Julian had heard it all from the other room, no doubt, but Julian had a girl over the night before himself, so why the sudden rage? Why ignore Micah for 2 days and then come in like that? Holding him down with one hand over his mouth, Micah rolled onto his side slowly, pulling his boxers back up with a wince. Micah's mind raced through possibilities. Was it jealousy? Over Louisa? That didn't make sense. Julian had done the same with girls and they'd never talked about anything exclusive. Or was it something else? Was Julian enraged, but why take it out on him like that? Micah wondered if Julian had been holding something back for those 2 days, letting it build until it exploded in the middle of the night. He thought about the way Julian had released him roughly afterward, not even bothering to clean up, no words, no explanation, just the door slamming shut. He sat up on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. His body ached in places he hadn't expected, the inside of his thighs, his lower back from the angle, his ass. Micah's thoughts kept circling back to the silence. 2 whole days, Julian had barely looked at him, let alone spoken, and then this sudden, angry claiming. Micah didn't know, he didn't want to guess wrong. All he knew was that Julian had fucked him like he was furious. The questions wouldn't stop. Why now? Why like that? Why ignore him first and then take him so roughly, so possessively? Micah closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. His thoughts stayed on Julian, on the 2 days of silence, on the brutal thrusts that had left him sore and confused, wondering what the hell was going on and why it had to happen that way. His body ached, his hole raw and slick with leftover lube, but exhaustion pulled him under. In the dream, everything felt softer. He was sitting across from Julian at a cozy Mexican restaurant, candlelight flickering between them. Julian smiled easily, reaching over to hold his hand, no anger in his eyes. They laughed about nothing important, shared bites of food, and Micah felt safe, wanted in a gentle way. Julian leaned in close, whispering something warm, and Micah leaned forward to meet him halfway, their lips almost touching. The dream shattered when strong hands flipped him onto his stomach. A sudden painful stab of pressure drove into his lower abdomen as his eyes flew open. The restaurant vanished. He was face down on his mattress in the beachside house that looked more like a mansion, moonlight still faintly visible through the windows, but the sky already lightening. Someone was on top of him, already buried deep, thrusting hard. Micah's first confused thought was that he had fallen asleep right after the earlier fuck and it was still 2 in the morning, but the light told him otherwise. It had to be later. A familiar voice grunted above him. Julian, one hand pressed firmly between Micah's shoulder blades, pinning his back down while the other kept his face muffled in the sheets. Micah tried to turn his head, but the pressure only increased. He realized he hadn't been dreaming the whole time. This was real, happening now, and Julian was already fucking him again. Julian has rough sex with Micah in Micah's cabin. Scene retracted, read extended version on Wattpad. Without another word, Julian pushed Micah away from him, crossed the room, opened the door, and slammed it shut behind him. The beach house fell silent except for Micah's heavy breathing. His clock read 7:08 a.m. His ass throbbed, red and sore. The dream of the gentle Julian at the restaurant lingered in his mind, a stark contrast to the violent reality that had just ended. Micah stayed face down, trying to catch his breath, the questions from before still circling without answers. Micah remained on his stomach for another minute, staring at the rumpled sheets beneath him. The house was quiet now, too quiet. Julian had stormed out only moments ago, slamming the bedroom door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Before that, he had shown up at 2 in the morning, and now again at 7. None of it made any sense. Micah rubbed a hand across his face and sat up. His thoughts chased each other in circles. Was Julian angry? Jealous? Worried? Or was there something else going on that Julian refused to say out loud? Micah hated guessing games. Julian had a talent for dropping into his life like a hurricane, stirring up every emotion in the room and then disappearing before explaining himself. With a sigh, Micah pulled his shorts up properly and climbed out of bed. The hardwood floor felt cold beneath his feet as he headed downstairs. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows, painting bright golden rectangles across the counters. It was a peaceful morning, completely at odds with the chaos in his head. Micah opened the refrigerator and stared inside for a few seconds before deciding on eggs, toast, and coffee. Simple. Predictable. Unlike Julian. As the coffee maker began to gurgle, Micah cracked eggs into a pan. The familiar routine helped settle his nerves. A little. Micah heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up from his coffee. Julian appeared in the doorway. For a brief second, Micah thought he might finally say something. Anything. Instead, Julian walked straight past him. No greeting. No apology. Not even eye contact. Micah watched as Julian grabbed a bowl from the cabinet and scooped some of the eggs and potatoes Micah had cooked into it. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument. Julian acted as though Micah wasn't even sitting there. As though he were just another piece of furniture in the kitchen. Micah's jaw tightened. Seriously? After showing up in his room twice during the night. After slamming doors and acting like the world was ending. Now he couldn't even manage a hello. Julian carried the bowl into the living room without a word. A few seconds later, the television came to life. The familiar sounds of a morning news program drifted into the kitchen. Micah sat alone at the table, staring down at his plate. The irritation he'd managed to push aside earlier returned immediately. He took a sip of coffee. Then another. The television continued talking in the other room. Julian laughed quietly at something one of the hosts said. That was what finally did it. Micah set his mug down harder than intended. The sharp sound echoed through the kitchen. He pushed his chair back and stood. Walking into the living room, he found Julian sprawled comfortably on the couch, bowl balanced on one knee, eyes fixed on the television. Micah folded his arms. You're kidding me, right? Julian didn't look away from the screen. What? What do you mean what? Julian took another bite. Micah stared at him in disbelief. You come into my room at 2 in the morning. Julian remained silent. You come back again at 7. Another bite. You slam my door. Julian's jaw flexed slightly. And now you're acting like I don't exist. Finally, Julian muted the television. The room became silent. Slowly, he set the bowl down on the coffee table. Micah waited. Julian looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Like he'd spent the entire night fighting a battle inside his own head. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Micah expected. I don't know what to say. Micah blinked. The answer caught him off guard. Julian looked down at his hands. Julian didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the remote and turned the television volume up. The sudden noise filled the living room. A commercial blared through the speakers. Micah stared at him. Seriously? Julian's expression didn't change. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. Micah felt heat rise into his chest. 3 days. For 3 entire days, this had been happening. Not yelling. Not arguing. Not fighting. That would have been easier. Julian had simply withdrawn. Unless it involved sleeping together, Julian barely acknowledged his existence anymore. Breakfast conversations disappeared. Movie nights disappeared. Random jokes and teasing comments disappeared. The small, everyday things that had once filled the space between them had simply vanished. At first Micah had assumed Julian was stressed. Then tired. Then irritated. But 3 days was too long to ignore. And the worst part was that Julian refused to explain himself. Micah folded his arms. Would you at least tell me what I did? Nothing. The television continued talking. A weather forecast. Stock market numbers. Some celebrity scandal. Apparently all of it was more important than answering him. Micah laughed bitterly. You know what, fine. Julian didn't react. Don't talk to me. Nothing. Keep pretending I don't exist. Still nothing. Micah stood there for another moment, waiting for some sign that Julian cared enough to stop him. There wasn't one. Not a glance. Not a word. Not even irritation. Just silence hidden behind the television. Something inside Micah sank. The anger he'd been carrying for days suddenly felt exhausting. Because anger required energy. What replaced it felt much worse. Disappointment. Micah turned around and walked back toward the kitchen. The television noise followed him down the hallway. A few moments later, he heard Julian increase the volume even higher. As if making absolutely certain there would be no conversation. Micah stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked out the window above the sink. The morning sunlight still filled the yard. Everything outside seemed normal. Inside the house, however, something felt broken. Not shattered. Not beyond repair, just cracked. And cracks had a way of spreading if nobody bothered to fix them. For the first time in days, Micah wondered whether Julian even realized how much damage his silence was causing. Or worse, maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. Micah was still standing in the kitchen doorway when the front door opened. A familiar voice drifted inside. "Julian, you are not going to believe what happened." Paul stopped mid-sentence. The smile vanished from his face. His eyes moved from Micah in the kitchen to Julian in the living room. The television was blasting. Micah looked miserable. Julian looked completely uninterested in the existence of anyone around him. Paul slowly closed the door behind him. The silence somehow became even more uncomfortable. "Well," neither man answered. Paul looked back and forth between them. "Okay." Still nothing. "The atmosphere in here is colder than Antarctica." Julian continued staring at the television. Micah rubbed a hand across his forehead. Paul pointed between them. "What did I walk in on?" "No idea," Micah muttered. That finally earned a reaction. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. Paul immediately noticed. He nodded. "So we're in that phase." "What phase?" Micah asked. "The phase where nobody wants to admit what the actual problem is." Paul tossed his keys onto a side table. Micah let out a short laugh. "Trust me, if I knew what the problem was, I'd tell you." Paul looked toward the living room. "Julian." "Nothing." The television continued talking. Paul sighed dramatically. "Oh, we're doing the silent treatment." Julian reached for the remote and increased the volume another notch. Paul stared at him. "You are a grown man." No response. Paul looked back toward Micah. "How long?" "3 days." Paul's eyebrows shot upward. 3 days. Micah nodded. "Unless he wants sex, he barely talks to me." Paul winced. "Okay, that's bad." Julian muted the television for half a second. Nobody asked for commentary. Then he unmuted it. Paul blinked. "There he is." Micah couldn't help it. A small laugh escaped him despite himself. Julian shot him an annoyed look. It lasted less than a second before he returned his attention to the television. Paul noticed that too. Interesting. Very interesting. Because for someone supposedly ignoring Micah, Julian seemed awfully aware of everything Micah said and did. Paul folded his arms. "You know what's funny?" Neither man answered. Paul continued anyway. "The fact that both of you look absolutely miserable." Micah looked away. Julian stared at the television. "And yet neither of you is willing to have a conversation." Julian grabbed his bowl. Micah crossed his arms. Paul pointed at both of them. "This is why I work in a restaurant. Customers only yell at me for 5 minutes. You two have apparently turned emotional dysfunction into a long-term hobby." For the first time all morning, the corner of Micah's mouth twitched upward. Even Julian looked like he was fighting the urge to react. Paul saw it immediately. And smiled. Because whatever was happening here, one thing was obvious. Neither of them was actually indifferent. If they were, the room wouldn't feel this tense, the silence wouldn't hurt this much. People didn't get this upset over someone they didn't care about. That realization hung quietly in the room while Paul wondered how much longer these two stubborn idiots planned to keep avoiding the conversation they clearly needed to have. "Come on," Paul said, clapping his hands together once. "Why don't we go get brunch?" He pointed toward Micah. "We've got Mr. Miserable Sourpuss over here." Micah rolled his eyes. Then Paul pointed toward the living room. "And Mr. Permanent Scowl over there." Julian didn't react. Not even a twitch. He simply continued staring at the television as though neither of them existed. Paul sighed dramatically. "See, this is exactly why we need to leave the house." Micah folded his arms. "Fine." His voice rose slightly. "As I said, it might actually be nice to spend time with someone who acknowledges I exist." The comment was clearly aimed at Julian. Micah made sure of that. He glanced directly at him while speaking. "Nothing." Julian kept watching television. The weather forecast had apparently become the most fascinating thing in the world. Paul looked between them. You know, for someone who's ignoring him, you sure make a lot of effort to ignore him. Julian took another bite of food. No response. Micah laughed bitterly. There you see. Paul did see. What he also saw was the way Julian's shoulders had stiffened the moment Micah mentioned being ignored. The way his grip on the bowl tightened. The way his jaw flexed. Small reactions. But reactions nonetheless. Julian was listening. He simply refused to engage. All right, Paul said, new plan. He grabbed his car keys from the table. Micah, you're coming with me. Gladly. Paul pointed toward the front door. We're getting pancakes. Sounds great. Coffee. Perfect. Possibly waffles. Even better. Paul nodded approvingly. See, that's the enthusiasm I like. The two started toward the door. Micah deliberately didn't look back. If Julian wanted to ignore him, then fine. He was done begging for attention. Done trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. Done trying to pull words out of someone who clearly didn't want to speak. Paul opened the front door. Sunlight spilled inside. Just as Micah stepped through the doorway, a voice came from the living room. Don't be late. The house froze. Micah stopped. Paul stopped. Slowly both men turned around. Julian hadn't looked away from the television. Hadn't moved. Hadn't acknowledged either of them. Yet he'd spoken. The first voluntary sentence he'd directed at Micah all morning. Micah stared at him. You've ignored me for 3 days and that's what you've got. Julian didn't answer. The television continued playing. Paul looked upward as if asking the universe for patience. Then he muttered, I swear, dealing with customers is easier. Micah shook his head. Let's go. As they stepped outside, Paul glanced back through the doorway. Julian was still sitting on the couch. Still pretending to watch television. But the second he thought nobody was looking, his eyes drifted toward the front door where Micah had just left. Paul caught it. And suddenly he was even more convinced than before. Whatever was wrong between them, indifference wasn't the problem. Paul and Micah walked down the driveway toward the car, the morning air feeling cooler than it should have. Behind them, the house sat quiet again, television noise faint through the walls like a closed-off world. Paul tossed his keys into his hand. So, he said, glancing sideways at Micah, what's going on in there? Micah exhaled through his nose. If I knew, I wouldn't look like this. Paul opened the driver's door but didn't get in yet. He leaned against it instead, studying Micah. Julian seems to be in a bad mood. That's putting it lightly. Paul tilted his head. Has he had sex recently? Micah blinked, caught off guard by how casually that came out. He hesitated, then nodded once. Twice, he said, in the last 7 hours. Paul frowned, really? Micah's mouth tightened. Yeah, Paul gave a low whistle and shook his head like he was solving a puzzle. Okay, that actually complicates things. Micah looked at him sharply. What does that even mean? Paul finally got into the driver's seat but left the door open. Usually when Julian gets laid, he's not like that. Like what? Micah asked. Paul searched for the right word. Cold, detached, like he's trying to erase people instead of talking to them. Micah let out a short, humorless laugh. That's exactly what he's doing. Paul drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Did you do something wrong? Micah stared at the house for a moment before answering. I don't know, he said quietly. That's the problem. If I knew, I could fix it. Paul watched him for a beat longer than necessary. Then he said more carefully, or you're not the problem at all. Micah turned toward him. Paul shrugged slightly. I've known Julian a while. When he shuts down like this, it's usually not about one thing someone did in the moment. It's something he's sitting on and refusing to say out loud. Micah's jaw tightened. Yeah, well, he's sitting on it right on top of me. Paul gave a small, sympathetic huff. Fair. He started the car but didn't pull out yet. Look, he added, I'm not saying you didn't trigger something. Julian doesn't do silence unless he's either protecting himself or punishing whatever he can't admit he wants. Micah looked back at the house again. The blinds. The stillness. Julian, somewhere inside, refusing to look at him but still reacting to him anyway. Micah's voice dropped. So what do I do? Paul finally shifted the car into gear. Eat brunch first, he said, because whatever this is, it's not getting solved on an empty stomach. The car rolled forward slowly, leaving the house behind, but not the tension that had followed them out of it. Paul drove with one hand on the wheel, the other tapping lightly against the steering column as if he was already halfway through a plan. I have an idea I want to run by you, he said. Micah turned slightly in his seat. Smart, that's rare, go on. Paul snorted. There could be a lot of reasons Julian's being an asshole right now. Thanks for narrowing it down. But, Paul continued, ignoring him, if you actually want to figure out what's going on, there's one tried and true way to narrow the possibilities. Micah narrowed his eyes. I'm listening. Paul pointed forward like he was presenting a case in court. I'm throwing a dance at the marina, 8 to midnight. Micah blinked. Okay. Why don't you come? Paul said casually. Call Julian, mention it's happening, and here's the key part, mention there'll be cute girls there. Micah stared at him. What? Paul shrugged like it was obvious. It works. Micah let out a disbelieving laugh. You think Julian is going to show up to a random dance because there might be cute girls there? Paul glanced over at him. Yes. No. Yes, Paul repeated. Micah shook his head. That makes no sense, he's been ignoring me for 3 days. Exactly, Paul said, which means he's not acting rationally, he's acting reactive. Micah frowned. That's your theory. My theory is that Julian's the kind of guy who pretends he doesn't care while secretly caring a lot about exactly the wrong things at exactly the wrong time. Micah rubbed his forehead. That is, somehow both specific and useless. Paul smiled. Look, I've known guys like him. You don't pull them out with logic, you pull them out with friction. Friction. Social friction, Paul corrected. Crowds, attention, competition, someone else taking up space he thinks is his. Micah looked out the window skeptical. And you think cute girls at a marina dance is going to fix whatever is going on between us? I didn't say fix, Paul said, I said reveal. Micah went quiet for a moment. Paul continued more lightly. Worst case, he ignores the invitation and keeps being miserable at home. Best case, he shows up, gets annoyed, and finally acts like a human being again. Micah exhaled slowly. And where exactly do I fit into this brilliant plan? Paul glanced at him. You, he said, are the one thing he actually responds to even when he's pretending he doesn't. Micah didn't answer right away. That part landed a little too accurately for comfort. Paul turned into the parking lot ahead. So, he asked, you in, or are you going to keep sitting in that house letting him win the silent treatment Olympics? Paul's smirk widened a little as he merged through traffic. Not just showing up, Micah, he said. I want you to dance with every girl or guy at that shindig. Micah turned sharply in his seat. Excuse me. Paul kept his eyes on the road like he was proposing something completely reasonable. How Julian reacts or doesn't react should narrow down every possibility. Micah let out a slow, incredulous breath. This is your therapy plan. It's data collection, Paul corrected. Oh, that's so much worse. Paul continued anyway, ticking points off like a checklist. If he gets mad at you dancing with a specific person, that tells you something. If he's jealous of who you're with, then it's about that person. If he gets angry at the individual you're dancing with, it's possessiveness, he's reacting to them specifically. Micah stared at him. You're basically turning my relationship into an experiment. Welcome to emotional science, Paul said. Micah shook his head. This is insane. Paul shrugged. If he doesn't react at all, then it's not you. Micah went quiet at that. Paul glanced at him briefly before continuing. And if he gets mad and storms out, that's not about you either. That's a Julian problem, control issues, emotional avoidance, whatever you want to call it. Micah leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temple. So either way, he said slowly, I'm supposed to go flirt with half the marina to diagnose my boyfriend's emotional dysfunction. Not flirt, Paul corrected. Interact, dance, observe. Micah gave him a flat look. That is flirting with extra steps. Paul smiled slightly. Call it what you want. The point is, right now you're stuck guessing. Julian's giving you nothing, so you create conditions where he has to show you something. Micah looked out the window as they passed another intersection. That still feels manipulative. Paul didn't argue that one immediately. Instead, he said more quietly, so, is ignoring someone for 3 days and only talking to them when it suits you. That landed heavier. Micah's expression tightened. Paul added, look, I'm not telling you to hurt him. I'm telling you to stop standing in the dark trying to interpret silence like it's communication. The car slowed at a light. Paul tapped the wheel. This isn't about making Julian jealous, he said. It's about forcing the truth to show up somewhere, because right now it's not in your house. Micah stayed quiet for a long moment. Then barely audible. And if it breaks things more? Paul exhaled through his nose. Then you weren't standing on stable ground to begin with. Micah nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the passing road. Maybe Julian just doesn't like me, he said quietly. Maybe he's sick of me and doesn't even want to bother driving me to the mainland just to put me on a train. Paul let out a short laugh, sharp, immediate. Oh, come on. Micah glanced at him, expression flat. Paul shook his head. If Julian didn't want you there, you'd already be gone. Micah frowned. That's not. It is, Paul cut in, still driving. He doesn't put up with mosquitoes, flies, or anything that takes up space and annoys him. He removes problems. He doesn't let them linger for 3 days in his house eating his breakfast. Micah didn't respond right away. That was the part that stuck. He hasn't removed me. Paul glanced over, noticing the silence. Which means, he added more thoughtfully, this isn't about dislike. It's about something else getting in the way of how he's handling you. Micah exhaled through his nose. That doesn't make me feel better. It's not supposed to, Paul said. It's supposed to make it clearer. They drove in silence for a moment. Then Paul tapped his fingers on the wheel, thinking. Honestly, he said, it's probably cognitive dissonance. Micah blinked. Cognitive what? Dissonance, Paul repeated. Background conflict. Internal contradiction, you know, when someone's actions don't line up with what they think they're supposed to feel or be. Micah gave him a skeptical look. You're diagnosing him now. I'm interpreting behavior, Paul corrected. Julian's got a shame cycle too, I've seen it before. Micah leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. Explain. Paul nodded slightly, warming to his own theory. He's quite repressed, so instead of processing whatever he's feeling directly, he shuts down, avoids, and gets rigid. Then he doubles down on control, like the silence, ignoring you, because it gives him a sense of stability while everything else is messy in his head. Micah stared out the window. That still doesn't explain why he's treating me like I don't exist. It does, Paul said. If you're the trigger, you're also the reminder, and if he can't handle what he's feeling, he pushes away the thing associated with it. Micah's voice dropped. So I'm the problem. Paul immediately shook his head. No, he said firmly, you're the reference point, there's a difference. Micah didn't answer. Paul softened his tone slightly. Look, he added, people like Julian don't go cold for no reason, and they don't stay cold unless something inside them is overheating. Micah let out a slow breath. So your solution is still the dance thing? Paul smirked faintly again. My solution is still information, he said. You just happen to be the most reliable variable in the equation. Micah didn't laugh. But he also didn't disagree. And that, more than anything, told Paul he was starting to get through. Paul slowed the car a little, lifted his phone, and dialed Julian's number. Micah watched him. You're actually calling him. Quick check, Paul said, low stakes. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, Julian picked up. Hey buddy, Paul said immediately, upbeat. I forgot to ask when I was at the house. I'm putting on a little dance social thing at the marina tonight. A pause. Paul kept going before silence could take over. Do you want to come? There's going to be about 100 single girls there. You don't have to do ballet or anything, just showing up kind of thing. It's pretty casual. I've also invited some of the newbies, Sharon, Dee Dee, Tim, Sam, and Micah. Micah shot him a look in the passenger seat. Paul continued smoothly. They're all going to be there, thought you might. A sharp click cut through the line. Dead silence. Paul blinked. Hello, he said into the phone. Hello. Nothing. He pulled the phone away and stared at it for a second. Then he exhaled. Gods, he muttered, he hung up on me. Micah didn't say anything for a moment. Then flatly, that's your plan. Paul tossed the phone into the cup holder. That was a feeler, not the plan. A feeler, Micah repeated. Yeah, Paul said, and the answer was emotionally aggressive. Micah leaned back in his seat, jaw tightening, so he didn't even say no, he just hung up. Which tells us something, Paul said, more thoughtful now. Like what? Paul tapped his fingers on the wheel. Like the idea of that specific scenario hit a nerve fast enough that he didn't even want to engage with it. Micah stared at him. That's your takeaway. It's one takeaway, Paul corrected, not the conclusion. He glanced over briefly. But it's not neutral. Micah arrived just after early evening when the light over the marina had started to soften into gold, and the wind off the water carried music out across the docks. The place wasn't just a little dance like Paul had casually described anymore. It was crowded. Packed even. At least 300 people moved between the open floor, the food stands, and the edge of the docks where strings of lights reflected on the water. Music pulsed from the stage near the center, where a DJ booth sat elevated above the crowd. Micah slowed for a second, just taking it in. Yeah, he muttered to himself, this is not a small thing. He spotted Paul almost immediately. Paul was near the DJ platform, leaning in to talk to someone adjusting sound equipment, gesturing like he owned the space. Micah threaded through the crowd until he reached him. Paul looked up and grinned when he saw him. Ah, he said, you made it. Micah glanced around again, still processing the scale of it. There are a lot of people here. Oh yeah, Paul said casually. I've been planning this for 4 months. It's the only thing happening in June. This is a very small area. Micah raised an eyebrow. This is your definition of small. Paul shrugged, relatively speaking, yes. A bass drop hit from the speakers, and the crowd responded with a wave of movement, people shifting, laughing, pulling each other closer into the rhythm of the night. Micah watched for a moment, then looked back at Paul. So now what? He asked. Paul tilted his head slightly, scanning the crowd like he was surveying a map. Now, he said, you do exactly what you said you were going to do earlier. Micah frowned. Which version of that? Paul smirked. The normal one, he said. You talk to people, you dance, you don't overthink it, you just exist in the space. Micah didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked across the crowd again. 300 people. Noise. Movement. And somewhere in all of it, the idea of Julian somewhere, possibly deciding whether or not to show up or care or even look. Micah exhaled slowly. This is still a weird plan, he said. Paul laughed once. I never said it was a normal one. Then he leaned back slightly, gesturing toward the crowd. But it's happening, so you might as well stop standing here and start participating in it. Paul pointed through the crowd, scanning like he was picking options off a menu. There, he said, dark-haired guy looks cute. Then he shifted his finger a few feet over. Or you could dance with one of the ladies over there. Either way, make sure you choose someone who's actually single and clearly here to socialize. Micah gave him a look. You are way too invested in this. Paul didn't deny it. Go on, he said instead, stepping closer and lightly nudging Micah forward with a firm but playful push toward the edge of a small cluster of people near the dance floor. Micah stumbled half a step, then caught himself. Seriously, Micah said over his shoulder. Seriously, Paul replied. You came here to gather information. You don't gather it by standing next to me judging my event logistics. Micah hesitated at the edge of the group. The music pulsed harder for a moment, steady beat, warm bass, bodies moving in loose rhythm under the string lights. The group Paul had pointed out was laughing, already mid-conversation. A couple of people glanced at Micah as he approached, friendly, open expressions, no pressure, just presence. Micah's shoulders tightened slightly anyway. Paul called after him, quieter now but still firm enough to carry. Pick someone, one song, that's it, you're not signing a contract. Micah turned his head slightly, and if this is a bad idea. Paul shrugged. Then it's still just a dance, not a life decision. Micah exhaled through his nose, then stepped fully into the group's orbit. One of the women smiled at him first, tilting her head like she was already halfway deciding whether to pull him into conversation. The dark-haired guy Paul had pointed out stood nearby too, relaxed, watching the crowd more than anything else. Micah felt the moment stretch, simple on the surface, heavier underneath than it should have been. Around him the music kept going. And somewhere in the back of his mind, whether he wanted it there or not, was the quiet awareness that none of this was happening in isolation. Not really. By 10 o'clock the marina dance had fully settled into its late-night rhythm, music louder, laughter looser, the earlier stiffness of strangers replaced with familiarity. Micah slowed near the edge of the crowd, catching his breath between songs. He looked again. Then again. Searching the spaces between moving bodies, the edges of the dock, the cluster near the bar. Julian wasn't there. At some point, Micah realized he'd stopped actively scanning and started just assuming he wouldn't appear. By the time the next song ended, he finally stopped looking altogether. Paul's whole experiment idea still lingered in the back of his mind, but the results were already forming on their own. Nothing. No Julian. No sudden entrance. No reaction. Just absence. Micah wiped a hand across the back of his neck, the night air cool against his skin. He had done it. Danced with people. Talked. Moved through the crowd instead of standing on the edge of it. Even laughed once or twice when he hadn't meant to. And Julian had been nowhere in any of it. By the time the clock crept past 10, the conclusion had started to settle in, not sharply but heavy and slow, like something sinking. If Julian was going to show up, he would have by now. Or he would have made his presence known. Micah exhaled, looking out toward the dark water beyond the lights. Maybe Paul was wrong. Maybe this wasn't about jealousy, reaction, or hidden feelings waiting to surface under the right conditions. Maybe it really was just simple. Julian wasn't here. And hadn't been. And whatever that meant, it didn't involve this dance floor at all. Micah stood there a moment longer, letting the music and the crowd continue without him pulling anything from it anymore. Then he turned slightly, beginning to look for Paul, ready to leave before the night convinced him of anything else. Micah stopped mid-step. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, too many lights, too much movement, too much noise bleeding together into shapes that didn't quite hold still. Then he saw him again. Julian. Near the center of the dance floor where the music hit hardest and the lights flashed in slow waves across the crowd. And he wasn't alone. A blonde girl, pretty in the effortless way that made her stand out without trying, was pressed close to him as they moved together, not just dancing in the same space but fully in each other's orbit. Her arms were around his shoulders. His hand rested at her waist, guiding her as they swayed. Cheek to cheek. Close enough that the space between them didn't really exist. Micah's stomach dropped in a way that was immediate and disorienting. He watched Julian lean in slightly, saying something into her ear. She laughed, soft, familiar, like she didn't feel any distance at all. Julian didn't look up. Not once. Not across the crowd. Not toward the edge where Micah stood frozen. The music surged again and the two of them moved with it, closer than before, the kind of intimacy that didn't need explanation to anyone watching. Micah's hands went still at his sides. All the theories, Paul's explanations, the guessing, the silence at home, the strange emotional distance, it all narrowed into a single, sharp image. Julian wasn't absent. He had just been somewhere else entirely. The girl shifted slightly and Julian followed her movement without hesitation, still fully locked into her space, still completely uninterested in anything outside of it. Micah felt the realization land harder than anger. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just heavy. Because whatever had been happening between them the past few days, whatever confusion, avoidance, silence, wasn't just silence anymore. It had a face. And it was right there on the dance floor. Micah stood at the edge of the dance floor, the crowd moving around him like he was a fixed point in a rotating world. Julian's eyes were closed. That detail hit harder than anything else. Not just dancing. Not scanning the room. Not distracted. Fully there. Leaning into the blonde woman as if the rest of the marina didn't exist. Their movements weren't chaotic or casual, they were slow, deliberate, close enough that every shift of weight pulled them back into each other. Her head tilted slightly toward his and Julian didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned in more, like it was instinct rather than choice. Micah felt something tighten in his chest. Jealousy came first. Sharp and immediate. Then something worse followed it, confusion trying to catch up. Because this didn't match the Julian he'd been dealing with for days. The one who ignored him at breakfast. Who turned up the TV volume instead of answering. Acted like Micah didn't exist unless it suited him. That Julian hadn't looked at him. Hadn't touched him. Hadn't explained anything. And now he was here. Eyes closed. Completely absorbed in someone else. Micah's mind flashed back without permission. The kitchen, the silence, his voice rising, Julian sitting there unmoved in front of the television like nothing mattered at all. He had yelled. Julian hadn't reacted. Not then. Not once. And now this. The contradiction didn't make sense in a clean way. It didn't resolve neatly into anger or clarity. It just twisted. Micah swallowed, jaw tightening as he kept watching, even though part of him wanted to look away. The blonde woman laughed softly again, and Julian's hand adjusted at her waist, small, natural, confident. Like he had no reason in the world to be anywhere else. Micah exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, though it did nothing to settle what was building underneath it. So that was it. Or at least it looked like it was it. And whatever explanation Paul had been building in the car suddenly felt a lot less certain in the face of what was right in front of him. The feeling hit Micah like a physical wave. It didn't build slowly anymore, it spiked. Sharp, hot, and nauseating. He stood there for a second too long, staring at Julian on the dance floor, still pressed close to the blonde woman, still completely absorbed in her presence as if nothing else in the world had weight. Micah's chest tightened. His vision felt slightly unfocused at the edges. He turned abruptly, pushing through the crowd without really seeing anyone he passed. The music, the lights, the laughter, it all blurred into noise that didn't land anywhere useful in his head. Someone called his name. He didn't stop. He found the side of one of the pavilion buildings where the sound of the music dulled into a distant thump and the air felt colder, sharper, less crowded. For a second he just stood there, hand braced against the wall, breathing too fast. Then it hit all at once. He bent forward sharply. And vomited into the ditch beside the building. Once. Then again. His knees gave slightly, forcing him down closer to the ground as his body reacted before his mind could catch up. A third wave came after a pause, harsher than the first two. Micah dropped fully to his knees, one hand pressed into the dirt for support, the other trembling as he tried to steady his breathing. The noise from the dance continued behind him, distant, indifferent, unchanged. His stomach twisted again, but this time there was nothing left. Just shaking. Just breath. Just the echo of what he'd seen repeating behind his eyes, even when he tried not to look at it. For a moment, everything else disappeared except the cold ground beneath him and the uncomfortable realization that whatever this was, it had moved past jealousy into something that didn't feel easy to name or control. Micah stayed crouched there for a moment, one hand still braced against the wall, breathing unevenly. The worst of it seemed to pass. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself upright. Okay, he muttered under his breath like he could talk his body into cooperating. Okay, done. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stood fully, swallowing hard. For a second there was relief. A small, fragile pause where he thought maybe it really had just been something he ate at brunch with Paul, too much grease, too much coffee, too fast a day. Then his stomach turned again. Harder this time. Micah doubled over before he could stop it, retching into the dirt beside the pavilion again, one hand gripping his knee so tightly his fingers went numb. When it finally stopped, he stayed bent forward, forehead nearly touching his arm, breathing in shallow bursts. His body trembled faintly as the nausea settled into something duller but still present, like it could come back at any second. Micah sank down again, this time not even trying to stand right away. Sitting on his heels, he stared at the ground. Trying to make sense of it. Food poisoning maybe. Something from brunch. Something random and stupid and fixable. But his mind didn't stay there for long. It drifted anyway. Back to earlier that morning. The dream. Julian sitting across from him at a small table in a Mexican restaurant, warm lighting, casual conversation like it was normal. Like they were normal. Like there wasn't this distance, this silence, this confusion sitting between them. Just two people eating together. Laughing maybe. Existing without all the weight. Micah swallowed again, his throat tight. In the dream, there hadn't been any of this. No TV silence. Ignored words. No Marina. No blonde woman on a dance floor. Just Julian looking at him like he was something real, present, and chosen. Micah closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again quickly, like the thought itself was unsafe to sit with too long. His stomach twisted faintly again, but this time it didn't turn into anything. Just a warning. Just fear sitting in his chest with nowhere clean to go. He exhaled shakily. And stayed there for a moment longer, not moving, trying to figure out whether his body was reacting to something he ate, or something he was finally starting to understand he couldn't ignore anymore. Micah stayed crouched there for a moment, one hand still braced against the wall, breathing unevenly. The worst of it seemed to pass. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself upright. Okay, he muttered under his breath like he could talk his body into cooperating. Okay, done. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stood fully, swallowing hard. For a second, there was relief. A small, fragile pause where he thought maybe it really had just been something he ate at brunch with Paul, too much grease, too much coffee, too fast a day. Then his stomach turned again. Harder this time. Micah doubled over before he could stop it, retching into the dirt beside the pavilion again, one hand gripping his knee so tightly his fingers went numb. When it finally stopped, he stayed bent forward, forehead nearly touching his arm, breathing in shallow bursts. His body trembled faintly as the nausea settled into something duller but still present, like it could come back at any second. Micah sank down again, this time not even trying to stand right away. Sitting on his heels, he stared at the ground, trying to make sense of it. Food poisoning maybe. Something from brunch. Something random and stupid and fixable. But his mind didn't stay there for long. It drifted anyway. Back to earlier that morning. The dream. Julian sitting across from him at a small table in a Mexican restaurant, warm lighting, casual conversation like it was normal. Like they were normal. Like there wasn't this distance, this silence, this confusion sitting between them. Just two people eating together. Laughing maybe. Existing without all the weight. Micah swallowed again, his throat tight. In the dream, there hadn't been any of this. No TV silence. No ignored words. No Marina. No blonde woman on a dance floor. Just Julian looking at him like he was something real and present and chosen. Micah closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again quickly, like the thought itself was unsafe to sit with too long. His stomach twisted faintly again, but this time it didn't turn into anything. Just a warning. Just fear sitting in his chest with nowhere clean to go. He exhaled shakily. And stayed there for a moment longer, not moving, trying to figure out whether his body was reacting to something he ate. Or something he was finally starting to understand he couldn't ignore anymore. Micah stayed on his knees for a while longer than he meant to. The noise of the marina dance behind him felt distant now, muted, as it belonged to a different place entirely. Music still thumped through the wood and metal structures, laughter still carried on the wind, but none of it reached him cleanly anymore. It all came in broken pieces like something he was no longer fully inside of. He tried to breathe normally. In through the nose, out through the mouth. It helped but only slightly. His body still felt unsettled, like it hadn't fully decided whether the danger was over. Micah wiped his mouth again with the back of his hand and stayed still, letting his head hang forward for a moment. Okay, he whispered, barely audible. Okay, just stop. He didn't know if he was talking to his stomach or himself. A few seconds passed. Then a minute. The nausea finally stopped climbing. It didn't disappear, not completely, but it loosened its grip enough that Micah thought carefully that he might be able to stand without immediately collapsing again. He pushed himself up slowly, one hand sliding against the wall.